Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I love to go up into the Rockies, and one weekend on assignment I went up to Leadville, Colorado. It's so high up there you can barely breathe. I wanted to go to a special museum that honored America's miners, and I realized that Leadville used to be a going place.
Years ago, there were 30,000 people who lived in Leadville, Colorado. The population nothing like that now. Some parts of the town look like a ghost town, but a lot of it has been preserved to show our American heritage and the mining industry that went on in Leadville. At one time, there was more mining going on in Leadville, Colorado than anywhere in the world. As a matter of fact, you can jokingly say if you look up Boomtown in the dictionary, there's a picture of Leadville, Colorado there. Smack dab in the heart of town is one of the most unusual museums in the country. It is a national museum to mining and a mining hall of fame. And we're going to visit there on this week's American Montage. Carl Miller is the man in charge of the museum. It traces the evolution of mining and pays tribute to the men and women who went below ground to bring out the ore to make American industry work.
Well, the organization had started several years ago in the 70s in Denver, and they was going to build a $14 million new facility down there, and they tried to collect some money, and then the mining industry nationwide kind of went defunct in the early 80s, so the organization lay dormant for several years. And then in 1986, a group of mining people, national mining people, got together and said it's time to start a Hall of Fame and a mining museum on a national scale. There were several communities that was in the running. We, unfortunately, at the time had a vacant school because of a major mine closure up here that we had 3,000 employees, and that was closed down and went to about 25 employees. So that was one of the incentives.
It was unfortunate that you lost the mine, but fortuitous that you had the building open.
That's exactly right. So the school gave us this building we've got it for 110 years. It's 70,000 square foot building. We've got it for 110 years at $5 a year. And the county at that time was very generous to pay the utilities for 4 years, which is about $50,000 a year. With the building and with the contribution by the county and the very, very rich history of Leadville, we were able to come out number one and they chose to select Leadville to establish a permanent home for the National Mining Hall of Fame and Museum.
Carl, let's go back to the beginning if we can. I have been to various parts of Colorado, but haven't been over to, you might say, this side of the range before. The thing that amazes me the most in looking at all of the towns in the area, Leadville, Breckenridge, Dillon, and then you go up into the ski resorts, is now you have interstate highways that come through the area. You have wonderful two-lane roads that come down here to Leadville. But yet when the people first came here, they had to risk their lives to get over some of these mountain passes, particularly in bad weather. I mean, it's really a tribute, I think, to the fortitude of the early people who settled here when you look at how rugged these mountains are.
Well, that's true. And we're over 2 miles high in altitude. We're the highest incorporated city in America. And it's the old-timers had a tough time coming up these valleys and over these 14,000-foot peaks. And it's still tough. We still have some tough winters. We're 24 miles from the interstate, but our roads are never closed. We're always open, so I mean, it's our way of life, and we're very proud of it.
The Mining Hall of Fame. Retired miner Carl Miller, who is now director of that facility, is taking us on a tour. And as we walked up the front steps of the school, I mentioned to Carl that there laid out in front of us were many of the tools that tell the story of mining.
Well, the exhibit you see when you come in the door there is trying to catch the public's eye as they come in the door. But we've got 35 specimens on loan from the Smithsonian, and they're sprinkled throughout the museum. We have some nice artwork. This happens to be a Gary Praisen statue. Gary is a renowned mining sculptor from Helper, Utah, and is very famous in the mining world. Then we have the typical old gold pan with some real gold in it, prospector pick, another sculpture, some dynamite, which the early day miners used. And as we progress up the steps, you'll see a massive statue, a bronze statue about 8'6", and that's of a single jack miner.
Well, now, let me stop you for a second. This pan with real gold in there. I guess a lot of us have only seen gold on jewelry. By golly, you can really tell. Not that gold wouldn't be gold, but it would be very obvious when you sorted all that out that is what that is. Looks like little flakes.
That's right. It's little flakes of gold, and that's what the old-timers, exactly what brought them to Leadville and some of the other famous mining camps. And they panned it down, finally got rid of the sand and down into the black sand, which is mainly magnetite, and then the gold, the real gold, really stands out against the black background of the magnetite.
Now, you mentioned the statue. It's all the way up here. It's a beautiful piece of bronze work. I'm going to climb underneath the arm. What you have here is a fellow who has, a drilling pick in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other.
Yeah, it's called a single jack, and that was the early day hard rock miners. That's the only way that they could break the rock, and they would drill that just by a hammer, a heavy hammer. That's a 4-pound hammer, and the double jacks are 8-pound hammers. And then they'd load that with powder, with dynamite, and it was a very laborious chore, and they'd make about a foot a day.
Well, now, with the altitude as it is here, I mean, I know natives or people who move in eventually get used to it. Here I am with a little bit of nasal congestion to boot, having a little tough time breathing up here. This must have really been tough work.
It was real tough work. Mining is still tough work, but not to the degree it was 100 years ago when the single jack and double jack miners were doing their chores. When they first settled in Leadville, Colorado wasn't even a state then, it was still a territory. And then in 1860 it became the Colorado Territory, and Leadville was one of the first 17 original territorial counties. And that's when the mining boom started, and it followed the 1849 California gold rush. A lot of immigrants came and settled in Leadville, and some of their ancestors are still here today.
There's some great photographs. I know in the Chamber of Commerce building, there was a great photograph of just what a boom town this was. What is the population now? And at its highest, how many people lived here?
At its highest, in 1879 and 1880, there was about 30,000 people in the city of Leadville. Right now, we're just under 3,000, and the county as a total is about 6,000. But it was the wildest and boomingest mining camp in America during the 1880s and 1890s, 1870s, 80s, and 90s.
I can imagine the hustle and bustle. You can still see on the way down from the interstate, you go past the Climax mine, and there's a molybdenum mine, and it's just miles and miles of terraces and railroads and pipes and that type of thing. But in this painting here, it kind of gives you a clue of the fact that during that time, all the walls of the valley just must have been a mass of railroad lines and conveyor belts and every other kind of piece of machinery.
Well, this painting here is California Gulch, and that's where it all started in Leadville. And if you drove up that gulch, some of this cribbing is still there.
Now we're talking about what, wooden timbers to hold up where they've cut the facing back.
And this particular mine right here is the AY, and the Mini is right across here. Of interest there is that's where the Guggenheim fortune started, is right here in Leadville. Mr. Guggenheim, Myra Guggenheim, had the AY and the Mini. Other fortunes in the same area, the unsinkable Molly Brown, Charles Dow, co-founder of Dow Jones in 1879, he was in this very area. Marshall Field from Chicago had big investments here in the 1870s and 1890s. The May Company was founded here in Leadville. The Tabors. So there's a lot of fortunes in the late 1800s that was made in Leadville, and unfortunately they left then. They took their money and left.
Now we're talking about basically what types of ores were mined here.
Okay, the Leadville started out as a gold camp, and then it went through a boom, followed by a bust. Then it was a silver camp, and there was many silver barons here. That took them through the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and then the silver panic of 1893, the community fell on hard times. They tried to recover by building an ice palace in 1896, and it was just a one-year event, and of all years they had a very mild winter, so the ice palace didn't last even as long as they wanted it to. After the turn of the century, it really became a base metal camp, primarily lead and zinc with silver and gold as a byproduct.
Now, was it called Leadville before the lead boom?
No, this was originally called Oro City.
Oro, the Spanish word for gold.
Yes. And it's now they've, and then in 1878 is when Leadville was incorporated.
Okay.
And but we're still a mining camp. We're one of the few in the nation that have not lost our character. When you go downtown, you'll see we're still a historic, attractive little mining camp. Our biggest employer is Sarco. They own the Black Cloud mine up there. That's lead and zinc and silver and gold as a byproduct. We also have the large molybdenum mine. It's 11 miles outside of town in Lake County, but that's been going, it had its ups and downs in the last 10, 12 years. That's the molybdenum mine.
Carl, let me ask you about one aspect of that. I noticed driving down here, there's an area that looks like a lake bed now, but a marker that says there used to be cities there.
That was the city of Kokomo. There were several little cities up there, and Kokomo ceased to exist in like 1961 or 2. It's now covered with a giant tailings pond that will eventually be reclaimed from the...
Okay, now if you would explain that for us, why it was covered up and with what, you say?
Well, that's the molybdenum mine.
Okay.
And
is this the byproducts of it then?
This is the waste products of it.
Okay, the waste products.
That mine up there, I worked 27 years underground up there, and that mine, for every 2,000 pounds or every ton of earth that we moved, we had 9 pounds of saleable material. That was primarily molybdenum, tin, tungsten, and iron pyrite. And it was the largest underground in North America at a time, and it provided at one time 75% of the free world's molybdenum.
Let's put that into perspective. You say 9 pounds after moving 2,000 pounds of stuff, dirt, earth, rock. How does that compare to other ores being taken out? Well,
the Black Cloud mine here in Leadville, they are on average probably have 800 pounds of saleable material. So, I mean...
so a lot of work in molybdenum mining for a small return.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Carl, what years did you spend underground, and during those couple of decades, how did mining change? Were there many developments made in equipment or safety or other things in the time you were underground?
Well, the biggest thing I see, and I worked for 27 years underground, and mining went from an underground mine to an open pit mine, and the Climax mine now is an open pit. And as usual, there's a lot of new technology that's introduced, and other than that, I mean, it just evolves like any other industry. I mean, as we get more knowledge and technology gives us a better product.
Well, I hear you have some great dioramas there. I can describe it miniatures, and you look back and there's perspective drawn into the artwork. Let's go through these. The first one talks about the discovery of gold, and that was in 1859, and this poor fellow is out, almost looks as if he's freezing to death.
Well, a lot of the early day prospectors did a lot of prospecting in early spring when we still have heavy snows. The diorama room we're in right now, there's 22 dioramas that give you a sequential history of how mining evolved.
One of them jumping for joy because obviously they found gold while panning in a river.
There's a lot of early day mining communities, and that's exactly how the early day prospectors found it. They went looking for panning and looking in the streams. And that eventually, as that played out, then they went to underground mining.
Let's look at, before we go through the rest of this, over here on the right, this is really kind of primitive. It shows how in ancient Rome they dug into the ground. You can actually look into this miniature. I would take it that it's difficult to describe for someone who's never worked in a mine just how difficult it is, and in many ways how extremely dangerous it can be.
Well, that's true, and I think that's the beauty of our museum, because we can show the visiting public how mining has evolved from early man, and mining's been with us since mankind. It's been around, and we can show you through our museum, through murals, through dioramas, through artifacts, through specimens, how mining evolved and how important it is to this nation and to this world in general.
A retired miner, a gracious gentleman, is director of the facility, Carl Miller. He's been showing us through an old school building which became the museum. We're looking at a diorama, a series of perspective carvings and representations of the evolution of mining, and I notice as we walk past one that early miners used teams of oxen.
They certainly did, to bring in their material and their equipment up into these high mountains.
And this would be what, again, from the 1800s?
From the 1800s and the 1860s, the late 1850s and early 1860s.
Well, we have a crowd of people, and we're going to walk around them here. These are beautiful miniatures. Do you know who made these? Were they done locally?
No, they were done.
They remind me of things I've seen in the Smithsonian.
Well, there's a real unique story about these. The man that did these just passed away in January. His name was Hank Gensch, and he started making these in 1949. And he was handicapped. He was a paraplegic. He was in a car accident, and he started these, and he had a little museum over there in Central City. They're an absolute work of art, and they're very educational, and the public really enjoy them.
Well, the perspective is phenomenal. You look at this one, and here are two guys who are digging out, putting the what they're digging into. What is that? A little sluice, is it called?
No, that's called a rocker. But we do have sluices, and we do have long toms. That little rocker there, and they'd get the heavy gravels out of the way there, and the gold being heavier would settle to the bottom, and they'd eventually pan that.
So this is kind of a preliminary step.
Right.
But what we're seeing behind them, and it only goes back about 2 or 3 feet, is a diorama. It's an arc-shaped painting of the background, and it just has wonderful perspective.
Just like the valleys here in Leadville and other historic mining camps. I mean, they went to the high country trying to get the source of the gold. So they went to the headwaters of all of the streams. And the headwaters in our community, the Arkansas River, it starts right here in Lake County. And that's what brought the early day prospectors to Leadville. They followed the stream up.
Carl, this may sound like a really elemental question, but why did they find flecks of gold in the river? Was it simply somewhere upstream being pulverized as little pieces got churned around? Why was there gold in the water?
Well, Mother Nature made the deposit, and the gold through the spring runoffs and that, it eventually keeps running down, and it's being pushed down the river. And the early day prospectors had enough common sense to say, let's go to the head sources,
Obviously, it would be more concentrated.
And they found a lot of gold, and there's many fortunes here. After the early day placer mining, this is all surface mining or placer mining, and in their quest for gold, they evolved to hydraulic mining, which is still a form of surface mining. You can see in this diorama where they took high pressure hoses, and they'd wash the bank down. And you can see remnants of that in our community still today, how they had washed the gullies down. And after all of that gold petered out, then they eventually went to lode mining, and that's underground mining.
It's interesting to see in the evolution how, of course, as more and more miners came in and there was more and more wealth and organization, that they went from one man and a shovel to obviously a situation here using water under pressure and nozzles, not unlike a fire hose, that really took some organization and planning.
Well, that's right. They staked claims, and the claims, we have a claim map in there we'll be showing you, but they did organize, and they had a miner's code of ethics and miner's laws, and it was a very, very orderly. I mean, and if there was any claim jumping, the miner paid for it, and usually with his life.
Well, let's ask about that. You know, we see Westerns and Matt Dillon and all of that, and we think of it as kind of being a lawless place, but you're telling me that among these miners, there was a pretty strict code.
There absolutely was. And they for the most part, honored that code, and again, if they didn't, they paid the price very dearly.
The basement and lower levels have been turned into kind of a Disneyland to honor mining. Disneyland not in the frivolous sense of the word, but in displays and actually replicating what the inside of a mine looks like.
Well, what we're in right now is the hoist room, and this is an authentic hoist that came out of one of the early day Leadville mines. This particular one came out of the First National, which is a mine up there that's near our operating mine now. But that's an authentic hoist that lowered min material into the mine, and it also brought the product out of the mine. And as we progress, we're going to go into...
Well, now this I should explain. This is what basically is a big geared, we'd call it a winch today, and the steel cable is nearly an inch in diameter.
That's right. And it's a single drum hoist. Now today they have much, much larger hoist. But this is typical of the pre-turn of the century, early day hard rock mines.
What would drive this? Steam?
Early days were driven by steam and then electricity. But they had a lot of steam hoists at that time.
Now here we have tracks on the floor, so obviously it feels as if we're in a mine.
Well, this
It's
is
even damp down here.
this is built to scale. It's got all authentic equipment. This is a mine cage. This is the signals, how they would signal the hoistman. And again, the min and material came down in this cage, and also the ore was extracted and taken to the surface through this cage.
What it is in essence, is a primitive elevator.
That's exactly right. And this is a typical mine station, and at different levels in the mine. And as we progress through here, you'll see how mining evolved through the single jack and double jack that we had talked about before. This is how the individuals, either individual or in pairs, how they fractured the rock through just a 4-pound or a 12-pound single jack or double jack and a steel bar. And as we progress, this is one of the earliest mining machines. That's called a widowmaker, or it's really a stoper, but they call it a widowmaker because the young miners died at a very young age because of the dust, the silicon in the hard rock.
Now this looks kind of like a bazooka, a piece of maybe 3-inch sewer pipe with a handle. How was that used to break into the rock? Was it like a jackhammer? Or?
Exactly. And it's called a stoper, and this happens to be a steam one. And the drill bit fit right up in there. And that was typical of the 1870s and 1880s.
Well, how'd you keep from going deaf?
Well,
I mean, there was no OSHA back then.
No, that's right. And I mean, that's why it's called a widowmaker too.
I see.
And then as we progress through this replica,
I might point out here that the tunnels are rather narrow.
Well, it's built to scale, and they didn't take out any more rock than they really had to. They were following the early day veins, and so they didn't want to take anything since it was labor intensive. And as you see up here, this is a substation. That's a liner drill, and that's about 98 years old. And that drill really revolutionized the mining industry. That was the first drill that was air operated, and it had water there. That's a hollow drill steel, so that kind of lubricated the drilling and also kept the dust down.
Well, now this is much in an odd sort of way, the way some dentist drills do, where you have water which keeps the heat down and lubricates the drilling, I guess. So what we have here then is a machine that has a hollow shaft, maybe 1.5 inches in diameter. That's going in to break up the rock, but water is also flowing through it?
That's exactly right. And that again, is about 98 years old. The principle of that drill is still used today. The drills have changed, and as we progress through the mine, I'll be showing you what's called a jackleg drill. That's a modern drill. But the dentists, the principle of that is used. They probably stole it from the mining industry.
Carl, I've mentioned this before, and I guess I have to ask it again. Aside from the constant threat of cave-ins and everything else happening, you really couldn't have claustrophobia in work down here.
No, you can see how tight we are in here. It's very tight and enclosed, and the mines today are still this way.
Well, now here on the right, you have an area where you can kind of walk away from the tunnel into an area maybe the size of a phone booth. Obviously, they've punched maybe 15, 20 holes in the wall and stuck in sticks of dynamite.
That's called a drilled face, and that's called a 5-hole burn. That hole in the middle intentionally does not have a stick of powder in. And those 4 pieces of the sticks of powder goes off first. and then sequentially the other ones will go off. In the early days, now today it's much more sophisticated than our exhibit right here. It goes off in microseconds, and they have electric caps. But the old timers, the only way that they could time their shots is through the length of their fuses.
Wow.
And they got pretty proficient at it.
Now, this is when they would yell, what, fire?
Fire, and they'd go down and go around.
Everybody would hide and hope that it only caved in back here.
Right there.
Oh, you couldn't be tall and work in here either, could you?
Well, this is built to scale, and again, they didn't want to take out any more rock than they had to. This is a slusher, and this is nothing more, in my opinion, than an underground drag line. Mm-hmm. This is air-operated. And this used to move the ore, and they still use slushers in the hard rock mines now, but they're much bigger.
So they would go up to what is called the face, but essentially it's the end of the tunnel.
That's right.
Break that out, and then as they went forward, just as you would maybe lay pavement making a tunnel for a highway, lay more track back there.
And keep advancing that way, and that is the face. And in the mines, the sides are called the ribs, and the roof is called the back.
How deep would you go underground in the mines that were here in the Leadville area?
1,800 feet. And some of the other communities have deeper mines, but the mines that's operating today and the early day mines went down to 1,800 feet. The Black Cloud mine is probably about 1,700 feet.
I notice here in your replication you even have one of the beams that is cracked. So it looks very imperfect, but that would happen underneath.
That happens frequently. That's where a mining term we call it's taken weight.
It certainly is.
And you can see where the cap, that top timber is called a cap, and that cap, because of the weight of the fractured rock, is broke. And so they come in, and that's called a helper set that they're putting there until they can come in and remove that set of timber and put another set. And you'd see this very frequently in the mines.
You know, I can't help but think that in the days before all of this laser and sonar and Lord knows whatever else you can use to look into rock now that we have, that there were times when you would hit anything underground. I know in my reading about the digging of some classic railway tunnels, they would hit water, sometimes scalding hot water underground, and the seam would stop and it would be very unstable. Was it kind of like playing Russian roulette, that when you burst through, you really couldn't be sure what was ahead of you?
That's true. And it was true then, and it's true today, but not to the same degree. But there's a lot of water, especially in our mines here in Leadville. The deep mines just brought on a lot of water, and there's a lot of voids in there. There's not natural water crevices. And when the early day miners would go in and they'd drill and they'd and load around, then shoot that round, I mean, they were excited too. Naturally, they're hoping that when they come back and they had found the mother lode, but Lord only knows what they'd find. Sometimes, I mean, it'd be flooded out. Sometimes they'd find a natural void. So it was an exciting day every day.
This is just such a wonderfully done exhibit. I'm not trying to be patronizing because you've invited me here, but this whole layout, it's hard to believe that this is built in what used to be a school building.
Well, we've got about
it's better than anything I've seen at Disney, I think.
Well, we get a lot of compliments on this, and it's built to scale. It's real authentic. I mean, it's got the authentic mining equipment. It's timbered. The only thing artificial in here is the artificial rock, and that looks like the real thing.
Carl, let me, if I can, go back to something I mentioned before, and I don't want to dwell on this, but that's the safety thing. Needless to say, in our bringing ore out from underground, whether it be here at Leadville or anywhere in the U.S., and certainly we've entered a room in here where there are scenes from Georgia and the Carolinas, Alaska, Wyoming, because this is a national museum. There were a lot of deaths and injuries. I mean, we really owe a debt to those people.
We certainly do. And the miners looked out for one another. But mining in its early stages was a dangerous occupation. Well, this is called our crystal room, and the specimens range from very small specimens to massive specimens weighing 200 and 300 pounds. There are a variety of colors, and they're priceless. I mean, I hesitate to say on the air what this collection right here of 13 specimens. This is the Proctor collection, and they're from all over the world, as such as some of the other big amethysts and twin crystals and geodes, but it's a very unique room with crystals and other specimens that's just outstanding.
Boy, you know, this would be a geologist's delight. The thing that caught my eye, and it's almost impossible to describe. It's about 2.5 feet by 2 feet, white crystal with formations coming up out of it. I don't know, something out of Fantasia. What is this?
It's a quartz crystal, very rare. We don't know if there's another one in the world like that. And there's some 27 quartz crystals that they're ranging maybe 18, 20 inches sticking out in various parts of the specimen. And that probably weighs about 200 pounds. And it came from Arkansas.
Now, over here in the corner is a rock, almost a sphere of rock, a boulder maybe 1.5 feet in diameter with a hole broken in one side, and inside it's all crystal of a different color.
That's a massive geode, and that's about a 300-pound geode. I think in gift shops and rock shops around the country you see small geodes, but you very seldom see anything like that.
And then here you have some of the prettiest, most unusual colors. This is malachite. While I'm thinking about it, what was the ore that people confused as being gold and wasn't?
It's iron pyrite, or commonly called fool's gold, and it still confuses people today.
Now this looks really incredible. Here's a mine chamber in which there's a huge overhang of rock that looks as if they're propping it up for safety reasons, maybe 20, 30 feet off the ground.
That's called cribbing, and they're using timbers to try and stabilize that rock. And that's in a copper mine, along with these specimens here. This is copper ore, this azurite and malachite. And that's typical in the mines here, too. They use timber, and nowadays they even use steel arches to stabilize some of that heavy, unstable ground.
Well, Carl, you have a great museum here. I'm living in Washington, D.C. I've seen some splendid exhibits at the Smithsonian, but this is just, it's educational, and it's fun, and it's authentic, and it certainly pays tribute to a lot of men, and I would suppose women over the years who were in mining.
We have a Hall of Fame upstairs. Right now we've got 118 people inducted, and we're going to be inducting 8 more. And there is men and women. Women has played a significant role. They have in mining, and we have several women that's been inducted in our Hall of Fame upstairs.
Now, Carl, the museum is here in Leadville, a little bit off the beaten path. You're about, 2.5 hours west of Denver, right off I-70. Open all year round?
Open all year round, 7 days a week, May 1st through the end of October, 5 days a week for the remainder of the 6 months of the year.
Carl, thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for coming.
Leadville, Colorado, with a great museum bringing back some wonderful memories of very dangerous work. I'm Dennis Daly.